Well, I don't think this would be overt strike into Russia. It might be covert. So in the cybersphere, for example, GCHQ is a cyber superpower, and they have the ability to degrade, disrupt, and ultimately to destroy if we think that there are attributable cyber attacks from Russia. Now, the difficulty again with that is if there are cyber attacks from Russia or someone else, the attribution of what is a state actor or non-state actor is also very difficult to do. What is not difficult to do is if there is, for example, outsourced drones flying in Denmark or whatever, where the Brits and Germans and others were providing capability, and you neutralize those drones either by lasers or jamming, electronic warfare jamming, or by overt destruction. That would be a different matter than if you were to intrude into Russian sovereign territory. So it would be far easier to deal with drone incursions into other countries by knocking those down either by soft means or hard means than it would be if you did overt action into Russian sovereign territory, which again, then you might have difficulties in terms of the definition of Russian sovereign territory, because under the UN Charter, the political independence of any state is inviolate, which is one of the reasons why they shouldn't have invaded Ukraine in the first place. So you can take action against saboteurs, you can take action in other countries where those things take place. Probably more difficult to do that in Russia itself. That's not to say that you can't do it. And one of the things is, of course, the 2015 shoot down of the Russian aircraft by Turkey was deemed to be a stress test for NATO, which NATO passed. Now, the Russians ultimately didn't take provocative action when that happened. They'd been warned a number of times. The ambassador was called in, and you need to have that pattern of warnings before I think you would do anything. So you come to the denouement after you give a number of warnings so that you can have your own pattern of, we said we would do this if X or Y occurred. That is likely to be the pattern, I think, in the future. Well, I think there's been a number of moves in the last 8 years, really, which started at the Warsaw Summit in 2017 to alter the posture of NATO. So the first thing they did after that conference was go to a enhanced forward presence, which is why you've got British battle group, for example, in Estonia, along with other battle groups from other countries in Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. So that started the change in posture from a reassurance posture to a forward presence and a deterrence posture, potentially going to deterrence by punishment. And this is really what Dragone means by what he's talking about. Now, we've actually seen a number of changes in how nations have approached this in the last few years, and all the thing that Dragone was talking about really comes under the rubric of anticipatory self-defense. Now, the British, for example, changed their notion of anticipatory self-defense, particularly in the counter-terrorist sphere, when we started drone attacks in Syria. And the reason that we could justify that in international law terms was we took the view that Assad had ceded sovereignty, and therefore we went to a posture of that anticipatory self-defense based on the fact that an attack could be imminent, or a pattern of activity could show an imminent threat. And that is really the customary international law test. The difficulty in actually doing this against Russia is, in hybrid warfare terms, is we really talk about hybrid warfare in 5 sort of areas, either deniable attacks, and that's one of the things why it's difficult in attribution terms, because Russians generally would outsource this. So, for example, if you see a warehouse being burnt down in London somewhere, which supplies things to Ukraine, it won't be Russians who do that. They might well outsource that to criminal elements, and therefore the chain of where that goes through and making that attribution is often difficult. The second one is, of course, information ops, propaganda and subversion. Third, proxy forces. Again, that's where attribution or using subsources is difficult. Fourth and fifth are economic coercion and territorial encroachment. Now, actually, in international law terms, all this comes from a thing called the Caroline Test from 1837, which is when the Brits actually went across the border into the US and destroyed a steamboat. Now, if you can put the attribution in hybrid terms that is also difficult in cyber warfare terms, then of course you could show a pattern of activity and therefore an imminent threat, and you might be able to do that. The problem in NATO might well be getting consensus on that. Now, that also doesn't have to happen in a just in a NATO context. So, for example, there would be a difference in, for example, a country like Estonia, where if there was an incursion from a Russian aircraft, the Estonians don't have the capability to shoot that down because they've got no fast jets. So that would have to be under NATO rules of engagement. If a Russian aircraft were to encroach into, say, Turkey, which it did, of course, in 2015, then under the Chicago Convention or something akin to that, sovereign airspace is sovereign, and Turkey in 2015 shot down a Russian aircraft based on their own rules of engagement, not on NATO rules of engagement. So there can be a framework that you can do this. The better way to look at it probably is what NATO has done in this year with Baltic Sentry, that there was a pattern of activity shown by Russia's activity in the Baltic Sea around undersea cables, and the NATO has stood up a new operation to make sure that they have absolute surveillance over energy and data cables. And since that seems to have stopped the Russian activity, overt Russian activity there, particularly with anchor dragging and things like that. Well, I think you then need to look at what are the grand strategic and strategic interests of Russia to answer that. Now, what I'm just about to say, I've been using at least since 2018 in the Skripal case. So the first thing is the first grand strategic objective of the Russians is to regain lost territory and spheres of influence. That's part of why they are in Ukraine, for example. Their second grand strategic interest is to re-establish Russia as a global power. But a subset of that is two strategic interests, which are to divide and weaken the EU and divide and deter NATO. And you can do that you want to do that by soft power means or hybrid warfare rather than hard power, because if NATO were to mobilize and had the will on every metric, Russia should be destroyed quickly. So we see that from the spectrum of influence operations with politicians or by compromise. And of course, two of the reasons for compromise include money and ego. We saw Welsh Reform politician who was jailed for taking Russian slush money last week. So the greatest way to win a war is not by fighting it and to influence and degrade your opposition without having to use hard power. That's the acme of skill, according to Sun Tzu. So if you can use those levers rather than hard power, it's far cheaper than the overt use of force.